God's way actually is to disciple. And this is what Acts chapter 18 tells us as we look at the example of Rav Shaul, who follows in the example of Yeshua himself, who very much was someone who discipled, someone who taught people how they ought to live, but didn't necessarily teach them just in a one-to-one context, but taught them as a community. And sometimes we focus on the 2 Timothy 2:2 principle that everybody takes someone and disciples someone else, who disciples in turn someone else. And we lose sight of the fact that this is something that occurs within community. It is not just a one-to-one discipleship, although that is often key to it. And so in Acts chapter 18 and verse 18, we're picking up the story where Rav Shaul has been in Corinth. Corinth is a great city. It's a cosmopolitan area. It is commercial. And it is a city with a long history, both under the Greeks and then after a time, again, under the Romans. And after being in Corinth for quite a time, we learn some things about the way Rav Shaul has been reaching out in this city. So we read there in verse 18, Paul, having stayed many more days, said farewell to the brothers and set sail to Syria. And with him were Priscilla and Aquila. At Cenchrea, Paul had his hair cut off, for he was keeping a vow. So we see a number of things here. First of all, Rav Shaul was in Corinth for quite an extended amount of time. He was there for many days, and by the word brothers, we know that now he had friends, people who were close to him, people who were not simply those whom he had taught, but who shared with him. He had a place in their hearts. They had a place for him in their hearts in return. And they were now brothers and sisters in Messiah. Rav Shaul had built relationships. And so over time, they had become a family, so to speak. And he set sail to Syria. We get a little bit of the story because Priscilla and Aquila, who have come alongside him, who have come from Rome, and who have become key in what he is doing in Corinth, as he preaches the good news of Yeshua HaMashiach right next to the synagogue. They are going with him on his journeys. And we read that he went to Cenchrea on his way. This is the port from which he would leave Corinth. And it's actually today a town of, I looked on the web, 288 people live there today. But at that time, it was a port, and it was a suburb of Corinth. And people would obviously go there as one of their routes out of Corinth and to go eastward, which would be towards Israel, which is where Rav Shaul was ultimately going. And so he goes to Cenchrea, and what we learn about him at this point, something that has not been said is before now, is that he's made a vow. And by the fact that his hair is being cut, we know now that it is the vow of a Nazirite. A Nazir is someone who is mentioned in Numbers chapter 16. And he is someone, a Nazir is someone who takes a vow of dedication of themselves to the Lord. And one of the signs of their vow is that they will not drink any alcohol, that they will not come in contact or even be in the same building as someone who is deceased, and they will let their hair grow. That's all, more or less what Numbers tells us, that these three things characterize a Nazir, someone who takes upon themselves a vow of separation to the Lord. So Rav Shaul, if you can put yourself back in that situation, before he came to Athens, to Corinth, he had been in Athens. Athens is this tremendously pagan city. And Rav Shaul says later, when I came to Corinth, I resolved not to speak of anything else but our Messiah, his death, burial, and resurrection. In Athens, he had spoken in the language of the Greek philosophers. He had tried to reach them at their level. This is becoming a Greek unto the Greeks, and standing in the position of the great philosophers at the Acropolis. He had proclaimed Messiah. In the words of their own prophets, he had declared the Lord to them. But now he had made a vow. And we can presume that this is related to the vow that is being mentioned here in Acts chapter 18. He had had his hair cut off at Cenchrea. The vow of a Nazir was concluded, as we read later on in Numbers chapter 16, with the cutting off of the hair. So when you were a Nazir, your hair would grow long. The most famous example of this, of course, is Samson. His hair grew very long. It was a sign of his commitment to God, his separation. And so Rav Shaul had long hair. Now we have to go back again to 1 Corinthians, where Rav Shaul says, talking to a specific situation where there are obviously people who are dressing like the opposite gender. He says it is shameful for a man to have long hair. Now here's Rav Shaul. He clearly had long hair because he was a Nazir. And so for this purpose, we realize that he was not giving a blanket rule for all situations and all people. I used to be very judgmental of people with long hair, and now that I've lost mine, I'm actually just jealous. But, here was Rav Shaul. He had long hair, and he had to have it cut. Now, if you were in Jerusalem, you would have it cut, you would take it to the priest, it would be offered up, and actually the Talmud is interesting because it records a story of a young man who was very handsome, and he saw a picture of him, he saw an image of himself reflected, and he knew how handsome he was, and it was a distraction to him because he didn't want to get vain. So he went to the high priest and he said, I want my hair cut off, and I want to make an offering to the Lord so that I'm not so taken with my gorgeous hair. So the high priest actually said, well, that's a very strange request, but he agreed to it because the motive was correct. A Nazirite would have their hair cut off, they would take it, and with the peace offering, it would be burned up to the Lord, and their vow would be complete. And so for the entirety of his time in Corinth, you can imagine Rav Shaul's been there for quite a while, his hair is growing down his back, he's quite distinctive, and when he later on tells the Corinthians, you should not have long hair, they all remember him as the long-haired guy who was preaching to them. Nevertheless, he is taking a vow. This is important in Acts, not just because of now we've had a little background to it, but in Rav Shaul's day, if you took that vow, you were doing so in conjunction with your commitment to your Jewish people, to your commitment to the God of Israel, to your commitment to the traditions of Israel. This was something that was done by those who were religious, those who had a particular passion for God and wanted to be pure for his service. And so Rav Shaul has taken this vow, which according to tradition was a minimum of 30 days. But he had done it for far longer. He had taken this vow, and he had chosen, as a result, to live conspicuously, visibly, in more ways than one, as someone who was committed to his Jewish heritage, to its interpretation, to the Torah, and to faithfulness to God. This sets the stage, actually, for the second time this is mentioned in Acts chapter 21, just a couple chapters later, and we will get to that in a few weeks. But in Acts chapter 21, verses 23 to 24, when Rav Shaul gets to Jerusalem, there are people who are saying that he is teaching the Jewish people among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, forsake obedience to the Torah, telling them not to circumcise their children or to walk according to the customs. The customs are the traditions, the fence around the Torah that Jewish people were keeping in Paul's day, in Rav Shaul's day. And they said to him, "Do what we tell you. We have 4 men who have a vow on themselves. Take them and purify yourself along with them and pay their expenses so that they may shave their heads." It cost a little something because you had to make an offering, which meant you had to purchase animals for the offerings. And that way, they say, all will realize that there is nothing to the things they have been told about you, but that you yourself walk in an orderly manner, keeping the Torah. And so now we see, actually Luke has recorded Rav Shaul's obedience to this, or commitment to this tradition, more than once. He is someone who is committed to the Torah, he is committed to the God of Israel, and he's committed to the people of Israel. He is not encouraging or teaching Jews to not circumcise their children. So it's a very important scripture that we have here. This simple statement. Paul had his hair cut off, for he was keeping a vow. Is very much part of his life. And this morning we're looking at what I would call talmidut. A disciple in Hebrew is a talmid. And talmidut is discipleship. And we are all disciples of Messiah. We are disciples to some degree of each other as we learn from each other, as we together learn from him. And we also make disciples as individuals and as a community. And Rav Shaul is this example of discipleship. Before the Corinthians, as he has been bringing the good news of Yeshua HaMashiach, he has begun by entering the synagogue as someone keeping a vow, and now at the end of his time, as he leaves the city and goes just a couple hours away to the port of Cenchrea, there he gets his hair cut off, because now the vow that he has spoken about, of speaking only about Messiah, not delving into all that Greek philosophy, now that vow is complete. He has done what he had said he would do. So he is a great example to us. He lives his faith. He lives what he preaches. So they arrive at Ephesus. They get on the boat. They go to Ephesus. It's maybe a day or two of traveling on the boat. And there in Ephesus, Paul leaves Priscilla and Aquila, but he himself goes into the synagogue. So drops them off at someone's house, and the first place Rav Shaul goes, as always, is the synagogue. And there he debated with the Jewish people. And here we see another dynamic going on, as Rav Shaul is seeking to do what Yeshua told us all to do, to make disciples of all nations. Here in the synagogue, as he is debating, we realize by verse 20 that this is not a type of debate that estranges the parties from each other. This is not acrimony. This is not condemnation. This is debate over an issue, the messiahship of Yeshua, because the people asked him to stay longer. This is one of those synagogues where they're really interested. They're into the debate, but they have not made such an enemy over Rav Shaul as has happened at other places. And when he takes leave of them, he says, God willing, I will return to you again. So Rav Shaul, here he is. He is the master disciple maker in Asia at this time. He leaves Ephesus in verse 22 at the end, and then we read he lands at Caesarea. Caesarea is this great port city on the northern coast of Israel, or central to northern coast of Israel. It has an artificial harbor. It has racetracks. It has an auditorium, an amphitheater. It has government buildings. It is the place where the Romans have really put their foothold in the land of Israel. And that's where he goes, and he stops there. There are believers there. He encourages them. And actually, from archaeology, we know that there was in later years a area in Caesarea where Jewish believers lived, and an area also where the Jewish community as a whole lived. As the centuries went on, these communities continued to exist side by side, Jewish believers and unbelievers in that area. And so here, they asked him to stay longer, and he declined from Ephesus, and went to Caesarea and greeted Messiah's community, or as we might say it in English, the church. And I think, again, there's been a very interesting study just released on the fact that the word church was not a word being used to differentiate the believers from the Jewish community, but was a term that Jewish people themselves used for gatherings, for societies and groups such as these early believers. And then we read at the end of verse 22, he went down to Antioch. Actually, that's Jerusalem language, isn't it? That's the language you use if you're a Jewish person leaving the land of Israel. You go down to the other places, because he's at sea level in Caesarea. And so is Antioch, pretty much at sea level. So they went down to Antioch. And after spending some time there, he departed and went one place after another throughout the region of Galatia and Phrygia, strengthening all of the disciples. Rav Shaul continues to disciple. He disciples by example. He, by his very physical appearance, with the growing long hair, and his commitment only to speak about Messiah, he sets an example for the people in Corinth. He gathers around him, as a result, a community of people who are similarly taken up with a passion for Yeshua HaMashiach. And even in the synagogue of Ephesus, he is there making disciples as people, as they listen to him, are learning from Messiah, Yeshua. And now he goes throughout the region of Galatia and Phrygia, in other words, not too far from Antioch, strengthening all the disciples. And in doing so, what is he doing? My oldest son, he's my stepson, Jeff is a CrossFit trainer. He strengthens people. If you go to his gym, he will set you up on an exercise program and get you coming every 2 or 3 times a week, and you will do your repetitions and you will get strong. And he keeps inviting me, but he's too far away. But he's making people strong by putting them through their paces. Rav Shaul is doing something different, actually. He is fellowshipping with them. He is being with them. He is going through the scriptures with them, probably answering the questions that they have as they have been studying the scriptures and need someone to explain things to them. And then on top of that, he is no doubt correcting any misapprehensions that they might have, any wrong ideas. He is strengthening them and building them up. This is Rav Shaul. He has made disciples by example. And that's a lesson for all of us. It's not necessarily a program. It's not necessarily going through a booklet, but it is something that grows out of who we are, something that grows out of our being. Rav Shaul is an authentic follower of Messiah. And his commitment, even his visible commitment while in Corinth with the long hair, his commitment is one that is part and parcel of how he draws other people to Messiah. That's something we can all learn from, because all of us are influencing the people that are around about us, whether we know it or not, whether or not we intend to. We are an influence. And so, Talmidut, by example. The next 2 verses, 22 to 23, are what I would call Talmidut by outreach. He is reaching out, he is strengthening, he is building them up. And this leads us to the 3rd section of Acts chapter 18, the second part. And this is the story of Apollos. Apollos is this interesting man. He comes from Egypt, where many Jewish people live. There's a large Jewish community there. And amazing stories are told of that community by Josephus, who is the Jewish historian of that time. And he comes from this city where there's a famous Jewish philosopher called Philo. And Philo is one who's written extensively about the Jewish faith, about Jewish customs, and he's tried to make it appealing and understandable to Jewish people. It's a city of learning. It's a city that had one of the greatest libraries of the world before it was burned, and sadly, everything was lost. That really hits hard. And maybe Dr. Falk might, well, I know he knows a lot more about that than I do. But nevertheless, it is this seat of learning and seat of Jewish community. And this is where Apollos comes from. He's a native of Alexandria, and he came to Ephesus. It's all part of the Roman Empire, after all. Easy to get there, it just takes longer than it does in our day. And we read of him a number of things. He was learned, and right away, again, we think of Philo, and we understand there were a lot of learned people in Alexandria. It was a learned city. He was well versed in the scriptures. So not only being a scholar is he notable, but also someone who has been well versed in the scriptures. That means he spent time in the synagogue. It means he was religious. It meant he studied. He went to the daily or weekly studies at the shul, and he got to know the scriptures well. In those days, people didn't study like we do, where a professor might give you 10 books to read during a course. In those days, they would study intensively, and they would read slowly and carefully, and oftentimes commit more or less to memory what they were studying and work it through their mind, think it through deeply. He knew the scriptures. More than that, we read in verse 25, he had been instructed in the way of the Lord. So he knew, and I think the context tells us, he knew about Yeshua HaMashiach. And then we read about him as a person. He had a fervent spirit. He was passionate. He cared to share what he knew about God. He was enthused, and he was speaking and teaching accurately the facts about Yeshua, while only being acquainted with the immersion of John, or Yochanan, as we often say. So he arrives on the scene in Ephesus. And now we see another form of discipleship. He has come, maybe he's on business, maybe he's got a teaching appointment in Ephesus, who knows, but he's in Ephesus. And while he is there, he wants to share what he knows. And because he's so knowledgeable, people are coming around him, and he is teaching, and people are listening to him as he speaks out boldly in the synagogue. So they've got a double punch. First they had Rav Shaul, and now Rav Shaul has gone on his way, but now Apollos has arrived at the same synagogue. And here we read Priscilla and Aquila, the people from Rome. They too are obviously in the synagogue, and they are attending. And they heard him. And here we learn something else about discipleship. Because as they hear him, we read that they take time not only to listen, but once they have heard, then they take him aside. And that's actually very important. When we are wanting to make a difference in people's lives, it's very important to hear them, to listen, not to be arrogant and jump the gun and just tell them what we think, but first to find out what people think, to listen. So they heard him, and then secondly, they took him aside. They didn't embarrass him. They did it in a respectful way, and they no doubt did it in a kind way. And he's a very learned person, so he might have easily taken umbrage. He might have got angry and annoyed. Who are you? You are just people from Rome, and I'm from Alexandria, which is one of the great seats of learning, and I know what I'm talking about. But they took him aside and explained the way of God more accurately. They drew him along, and they helped him to understand better the truth about Messiah. We continue as we read and as we learn about discipleship in this chapter, because from here we read that they are instructing him in the way. The way is a term that is used throughout Acts for the early believers. We see it in Acts chapter 9, we see it in the next chapter, 19, chapter 23, and chapter 24. They were known as the way, and they explained this to him. They understood what he needed to know. He needed to know what the Jewish believers as a movement were doing, how they were sharing the good news of Messiah with their people, and what the full good news of Messiah meant for Israel and for the world. And so we read, when Apollos wanted to cross over to Achaia, the brothers encouraged him and wrote to the disciples to welcome him. And upon arrival, he greatly helped those who by grace had believed. So he's gone, possibly back to Corinth, because Corinth is in Achaia. If you look at chapter 18 and verse 12, that's where Gallio is. He's the proconsul in Corinth. and that in Achaia and in Corinth. And so now he goes back. Now believers are encouraging one another. Those who have been discipled are discipling others, and those who have been discipled by them are now going back to some of the original disciples, and they are building one another up, and the community is getting stronger. It is a network. And there we read in verse 28, he powerfully refuted the Jewish people in public, demonstrating through the scriptures that the Messiah was Yeshua. Rav Shaul set in motion by his own example, by his own passion for the Lord, by his own commitment to live for the Lord, a chain of events that could not be stopped, that resulted in the communities in Corinth, in the whole region of Achaia, and in Ephesus being strengthened and growing in the Lord, and the Jewish people too, being confronted with the good news of Messiah in a way that would draw them, in a way that would build them up, and would actually build up the community of believers in Messiah as God added to that early Kehillah those who should be saved. We want to be Talmidim. We want to be disciples. Yeshua said, make disciples of all nations. And it begins with us when we make that commitment to live according to the way God has shown us in his word, to live for him, and to do so not in isolation, but with others, so that together we can grow, building one another up in our faith.